Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The borderlands had been silent for centuries, a lush and fertile expanse that supported the kingdom's prosperity. But the silence had turned menacing. Fields were left fallow, towns abandoned, and only the wind moved through the skeletal remains of villages that once thrived. It was as if the land itself was mourning, haunted by the eternal presence of the undead. Gareth stood on a rise overlooking the barren expanse, his cloak whipping in the biting wind. Once, this land had been his home. The forests beyond had been filled with the songs of birds, the fields alive with the labor of men and women working together for the harvest. Now, they were occupied by the dead. Skeletons and ghouls, all in various stages of decay, wandered aimlessly across the desolate terrain. For years, the kingdom had sent its finest warriors to defend the borders, but none had returned. Gareth had heard the stories. Legions of knights and soldiers, noble men with shining armor, their banners snapping in the wind, had fallen to the relentless march of the undead hordes. And each time they fell, they rose again, joining the cursed legions that now seemed unstoppable. It was as if the dead were not just attacking, they were reclaiming something long lost. Gareth, once a legend in his own right, had long since put aside his sword. He had fought his wars, won his battles, and earned his place in the annals of history. But he had also lost much: friends, comrades, his own sense of purpose. He had retreated into a life of quiet solitude, content to let the kingdom find its way without him. But now, the call had come again. He had refused at first. It wasn't his fight anymore. But then he saw the desperation in the eyes of his old comrades. They spoke of villages overrun, families torn apart. The kingdom was on the verge of collapse, and no amount of brute force could turn the tide. And that's when Gareth knew, this was not a battle that could be won with swords alone. The decision had not been easy, but Gareth knew the kingdom needed more than soldiers. It needed wisdom, strategy, and the kind of leadership that didn't just inspire men to fight, but to think. And so, he had taken up his sword once more, not to lead an army of knights, but to forge an army of ordinary people. Blacksmiths, farmers, and tradesmen, men and women who had never seen war, but who knew the land better than any general. The first to join him were the desperate, those who had lost everything to the undead. Grief had turned their fear into anger, and Gareth harnessed that anger, directing it into purpose. The blacksmiths, men with arms thick from years of pounding iron, forged weapons that gleamed with promise. The farmers, who had spent their lives coaxing the land into producing food, now learned how to set traps and build defenses that turned the land into a weapon. Healers joined them, women and men who had spent years stitching wounds and curing ailments, now learning how to keep men alive amidst the horrors of battle. It wasn't easy. These were not soldiers, and Gareth knew it. Their hands shook when they held a blade, their eyes flicked nervously to the horizon, always watching for the inevitable march of the undead. But Gareth knew that strength came not just from muscle, but from the heart. And so he trained them, not just to fight, but to survive. The first attack came at dawn. The sun, pale and weak in the early morning sky, did little to warm the cold earth. The undead came as they always did, slow, steady, relentless. Their armor, rusted and broken, clanked as they moved in perfect unison, like marionettes on strings. Gareth's militia, hidden behind hastily erected barricades, watched in silence. Remember, Gareth's voice cut through the tension, calm and steady. They feel no fear, no pain. But that also makes them predictable. At his signal, the traps were sprung. The undead at the front of the line stumbled as the ground beneath them collapsed, sending them into deep pits lined with spikes. Flames roared to life along the barricades, and the skeletons that moved too close were engulfed, their bones turning to ash. The militia fought with precision, using the terrain to their advantage, herding the undead into choke points where they could be picked off one by one. It wasn't a glorious victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for the first time in years, the undead had been pushed back. The victory, however, was short-lived. Gareth knew that the undead were not an enemy that could be defeated by force alone. They were bound by something far older, something far darker than simple necromancy. The truth was buried somewhere in the past, a curse that had twisted the natural order, turning the dead into soldiers of an eternal war. It was on a scouting mission deep into the mountains that Gareth discovered the truth. The crypt was ancient, hidden beneath layers of rock and overgrowth, as if the land itself had tried to bury the secrets within. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, the walls lined with carvings that told the story of a kingdom long forgotten. Gareth's fingers traced the lines of the carvings, his breath catching as the story unfolded before him. This was once a land of great prosperity, ruled by a powerful king who sought to conquer not just the living, but death itself. The necromancer, a dark figure in the carvings, had been the king's most trusted advisor. He had promised eternal life, but instead, he had cursed the kingdom, binding their souls to an eternity of undeath. The truth was undeniable: the undead were not enemies, but victims. Their souls had been trapped, forced to march in endless battle for a kingdom that no longer existed. And the only way to free them was to break the curse, but breaking the curse would not be easy. The necromancer's power had been bound to a single artifact, an ancient tome hidden deep within the mountains. Destroying it would require a journey into the heart of the necromancer's fortress, a place where few had ventured and even fewer had returned. Gareth gathered his most trusted soldiers, men and women who had proven their loyalty not just through battle, but through their unwavering belief in his vision. They set out under the cover of darkness, their path lit only by the faint glow of the moon. The journey was treacherous, the mountains filled with dangers both natural and unnatural. But Gareth pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this was their only chance to end the war. The fortress was as Gareth had imagined it, dark, foreboding, and filled with the stench of death. The air was thick with the presence of the necromancer, his power palpable even in death. The tome lay in the center of the fortress, bound in iron and covered in dark runes that pulsed with an eerie light. As Gareth approached, the ground trembled. The necromancer's spirit rose from the shadows, a twisted figure of bone and shadow, his eyes burning with malevolent power. "You think you can end what I have begun?" His voice echoed through the chamber, cold and hollow. "You are but a fool." Gareth stood his ground, his sword held steady. "Your time is over," he said, his voice calm. "These people, your people, deserve peace." The battle that followed was unlike any Gareth had ever fought. The necromancer wielded the power of the dead, calling forth legions of undead to defend him. But Gareth's soldiers fought with a fierceness born not of fear, but of hope. They had seen victory, tasted it, and they would not be denied. In the end, it was not Gareth's sword that ended the battle, but his wisdom. As the necromancer's spirit lunged at him, Gareth drove his sword into the tome, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The necromancer let out a scream that shook the very walls of the fortress, his spirit dissolving into nothingness. As the dust settled, the undead army faltered. One by one, they collapsed, their bones turning to dust as their souls were finally freed. The war was over, the journey back to the kingdom was filled with silence, but it was a peaceful silence. Gareth's soldiers, weary but victorious, returned to their homes as heroes. The kingdom, once teetering on the brink of collapse, began to rebuild. Gareth, too, returned to his life of solitude. But this time, it was different. He had not just fought a war, he had ended one. And as he stood once more on the rise overlooking the borderlands, he smiled. The land, once cursed, was beginning to heal. And for the first time in centuries, the dead could rest in peace. Gareth stood on the ridge, the wind now a familiar companion, blowing softly through the rolling hills that once served as a battleground. He watched as the first signs of new life began to take root in the soil, the green of grass emerging through cracks in the earth, once trampled by the undead's relentless march. It had been weeks since the final battle, but the peace that had settled over the land felt both foreign and fragile, as if it could be snatched away at any moment. He couldn't shake the weight of the silence. It wasn't the stillness of death that haunted him now, but the silence of a world that no longer had to fight. The war was over, and yet, in his heart, Gareth found no sense of relief. There were no cries of victory, no jubilant celebrations. Only the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding what had been lost. He had done what no other could. He had led an army of the living to victory not through brute strength, but through careful strategy and wisdom. He had freed not only his people from the terror of the undead but also those cursed souls, bound for centuries to a war not of their making. The kingdom owed him its future, yet all Gareth could think of was how little had truly changed for him. The border towns began to repopulate as families returned to their homes, many of them seeing, for the first time in years, a future free of fear. Gareth's men, no longer ordinary civilians but hardened by battle, had begun to drift back to their lives. The blacksmiths had returned to their forges, now crafting tools for the fields instead of weapons for war. The farmers, once soldiers in his militia, sowed seeds where they had once dug trenches. It was as if they had found their peace in returning to the mundane, leaving behind the specter of the past, and yet, Gareth remained. He had no forge to return to, no fields to tend. His life, for so long, had been defined by battle, and now, standing at the edge of peace, he was unsure where to go next. His feet, however, carried him to the only place that still held meaning, the ancient crypt where it had all begun. The journey was long and grueling, but it gave him time to think, time to reflect on what had driven him to take up arms again after so many years. He hadn't fought for glory, nor for the kingdom's reward. The truth was far more complex, that he had fought to honor the dead. Those soldiers who had fallen, who had risen again not by choice but by curse, were always in his mind. They had been warriors once, just as he had been. He could not bear to see them reduced to mindless instruments of war, their memories forgotten, their legacies erased. That had been his true motivation, restoring honor to the fallen. When Gareth finally arrived at the crypt, it was as foreboding as he remembered, though the air around it seemed lighter now, free of the dark magic that had once choked the life from the land. The tombstones were still weathered and broken, but there was a sense of stillness here, as if the souls that once wandered had finally been laid to rest. He knelt before the crypt's entrance, his hand resting on the cold stone. "It's done," he whispered, though no one was there to hear him. "You're free now." For a moment, Gareth allowed himself to feel that release. The weight of the war, of the hundreds of lives he had taken and the countless more he had saved, lifted from his shoulders. The silence, for once, felt like solace, not a curse. He stayed there for hours, kneeling in the dirt, letting the memories of battle wash over him. His mind wandered back to the faces of his comrades, those who had stood with him during that final confrontation with the necromancer's spirit. They had fought not out of fear or hatred, but out of a shared belief in what was right. It had been Gareth's guidance that had given them that conviction, but it was their courage that had carried them through. In the end, it wasn't the undead that Gareth thought of. It was the living. The farmers, the blacksmiths, the healers, those men and women who had left their homes to stand beside him in defense of a land they barely knew. They were the true heroes, not him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hills, Gareth rose to his feet. He had spent enough time in the company of the dead. It was time to live again. He made his way back to the village, his heart lighter with every step. The people greeted him with quiet nods of respect, but there were no grand celebrations. Life was returning to normal, and that was all the thanks Gareth needed. He was content to fade into the background, to let the kingdom rebuild without his presence looming over it. But peace, he soon learned, was not as simple as it seemed. Though the curse had been broken and the undead defeated, the kingdom itself was still fractured. Years of war had left its people divided, mistrustful of one another. The nobles squabbled over the remaining land, each seeking to carve out a piece of power for themselves. And the common folk, weary from years of fighting, had little patience for the politics of the capital. It wasn't long before Gareth found himself drawn back into the fray, not by choice, but by necessity. A messenger arrived at his doorstep one evening, breathless and disheveled, bearing a letter sealed with the king's crest. Gareth took the parchment, already knowing what it would say. The king, in his desperation, was calling on him once more, but this time, it wasn't an enemy from outside the kingdom that threatened them. It was an enemy from within. The nobles, restless in the wake of the war's end, had begun to rise against the crown. They believed that the king had failed them, that his inability to defend the kingdom against the undead had made him weak. Gareth had seen the signs in the weeks following the final battle, the whispered conversations, the secret meetings. It was only a matter of time before the kingdom descended into civil war. Gareth read the letter in silence, his expression unreadable. The king's words were filled with desperation, pleading for Gareth to return to the capital and help him restore order. He was offering land, titles, wealth, everything that Gareth had once sought in his youth, but none of that mattered now. For so long, Gareth had fought to protect the kingdom, to bring peace to the land. But as he folded the letter and set it aside, he realized that peace could not be given by a king or a knight. It had to be chosen by the people themselves, and so, for the first time in his life, Gareth made the decision not to fight. He would not return to the capital. He would not rally the people to the king's side. He would not lead another army into battle. Instead, he would stay in the village, tending to the land and living quietly among the people he had fought to protect. He had given enough of himself to the kingdom. Now it was time to live for himself. The king's messenger left without protest, though Gareth could see the disappointment in his eyes. But Gareth knew that the kingdom did not need another war. What it needed was healing, and that could only come from within. As the days passed, Gareth found peace in the simplicity of village life. He worked alongside the blacksmiths, repairing tools and helping to rebuild homes. He shared meals with the farmers, laughing and talking about the future instead of the past. And slowly, the memories of war began to fade, but the lessons of the war remained. Gareth had learned that true strength did not come from the sword, but from the heart. It was not the undead that had been his greatest enemy, but the fear and hatred that had consumed the kingdom. And in the end, it was not battle that had brought peace, it was compassion. The kingdom would heal in time. It would rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. And Gareth, though no longer a knight, would live to see it. He had fought his last battle. And for the first time in his life, Gareth knew that he was free.